Hey everybody, it's 1:30. We welcome everybody back to the afternoon session of the Federal Health at Home Technology Summit. And the next session here is led by Dr. Gina Conenello. Gina, please go ahead.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Gina Conenello. I work at BARDA in the Drive launch office. And formerly I was at FDA working on diagnostics for infectious disease, most recently on home use diagnostics. And so we've kind of assembled this panel today to continue the discussion that we've heard this morning about the use, impact, and equity of home technologies for healthcare, and furthering that to think about and focus on how we get these technologies and products into people's homes. Now, the way we've set this up and the panelists that we've included here, I've decided to focus on using COVID tests, home COVID tests and home flu tests as kind of an example of how we can look at logistics and how we're getting technology to people, whether that's direct shipment or shipping to retail locations or through websites. And so we're going to hear from our panelists. It's going to be a fireside style chat where I'm going to ask some general questions. So on our panel, we have Dr. Matthew Humbard, who is the Diagnostics Domain Lead in ASPR at the Industrial Base Management and Supply Chain Program Office. We have Dr. Barry Lutz of the University of Washington, who ran the Seattle flu study pre-pandemic, which was looking at the use of home flu tests during respiratory season to look at the distribution and impact of those. And then we have Dr. Sean Parsons of Ellume, who is the developer and manufacturer of COVID-19 home use antigen tests. And so for this session, we really also encourage questions from the audience, and I'll be able to ask those to the panelists as well. To start us off, I think the first thing we want to learn about is what is or was the biggest challenge in getting tests to individuals during this pandemic, either by direct shipment, distribution to retail stores or websites, and then kind of what are the challenges and benefits to the different types of distribution, that you can have. And this is assuming that the product is already FDA cleared, you've gotten your regulatory go-ahead to go into people's homes. So I'll open it up, everybody can unmute.
I'm happy to start. I have for our work with the Seattle flu study, I should mention there were many other investigators who were doing various parts of the study, and I worked with Matthew Thompson on some home testing clinical studies. So we weren't working with a regulated product, but it was under IRB authorization, but similar logistical challenges. We actually set out to figure out how different models for running clinical studies, and so we faced a lot of delivery challenges. The big one is timing, right? Trying to get tests to people in time, and so we started off with a nationwide study where we were trying to do just-in-time delivery of tests. So somebody alerts that they have symptoms, and a test is delivered to them. And there, as you can imagine, it was expensive to do rapid shipment. Often we ended up having people not test until long after they had developed symptoms, and so obviously the actionability of that is you've lost a window of time, where you can really take action. We also tried sort of at the opposite end of the spectrum to do pre-positioning, which from a commercial sense you could imagine doing as well. Where people we distributed tests to people before flu season, and this was prior to the pandemic, and had people it was sitting in their bathroom, or their kitchen counter, whatever, ready for them to use when they needed it, when they started to have symptoms. Obviously, that addresses the time factor quite well because the test is right there ready for them to use, but is potentially costly and wasteful. You've got a lot of tests sitting around that may never be needed. And so I think, and there are some potentially models in between that we could talk if there's interest.
Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Conenello. So Ellume was actually the first home antigen test approved by the FDA, and we found ourselves in the thick of things through that period of December 2020 and January 2021. The distribution side, our experience was that the big nationwide retailers, CVS in particular, but also Walgreens, Walmart, Rite Aid, were all desperate for product. They had channels available. They were actually very enthusiastic about helping and were bending over backwards to give access to their channels. And the hardest part from our side was actually the before we've made it, the upstream supply chain management, manufacturing part of it, which I appreciate that wasn't the specific question, but that limitation on supply created significant limitations on our ability to get product out to the CVSs of the world and out through the Amazons of the world to take that out. When we did, it pretty much disappeared straight away. You know, there wasn't a significant delay between it going to CVS or Amazon and ending up in people's hands. Whether that ends up in the hands of the people who are most in need of it is another question. But the ability to move that out into the community was very swift. Those existing distribution channels, the ones that are so well developed with an incredible amount of investment that's gone into them over the years, were in our experience the ones that could respond very swiftly through the pandemic. And that probably goes to a bigger learning from the entire pandemic period, which is that doing new things, doing big, complicated new things in the middle of a pandemic with all of the challenges of recruitment and training and communication and supply chains is very hard. So certainly our experience was where you could leverage that big, significant existing infrastructure that was effective through the heat of the pandemic.
Thank you. Matt, I'd love to hear how the government tackled this, as we all probably have received our home COVID tests in the mail through the US Post Office, but there's even more to the distribution of COVID tests during the pandemic. I wonder what your take on this.
Yeah, so from our point of view at ASPR and the working group prior to being attached to ASPR was always the unpredictability of the caseload and the COVID caseload in the population led to wild swings in demand for the test, and it always seemed to be out of sync with the manufacturing capacity, just based on the availability of bringing new manufacturing online, or as Sean stated, upstream challenges for supply chain issues that would crop up, like electrical components or plastics, the medical grade plastics that were needed for these devices. It always felt like it was out of sync with the market. So one of the strategies that the HHS tried to deploy were programs like the USPS program that soaked up excess demand when demand was low, excess manufacturing when demand was low, and pulled back on that when demand was high. But also just the ability to use the existing logistical machine that is the USPS to bolt on an additional test distribution and soak up some of that excess manufacturing capacity when needed, I think helped. At least we have data that suggested it helped stabilize the market a little bit for the lowest parts of the demand for these devices, at least.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about the differences in logistics and distribution when we're talking about acute situations like an emergency or a respiratory season versus more kind of chronic conditions where you would have a kind of a steady supply. And a lot of what we're talking about within BARDA and pandemic preparedness is going to be kind of those ups and downs, and to have, I think it's interesting to hear that the government kind of was a way to stabilize the need, and to buy supplies when their need was low and to back off when need was high. And so I think along with that is now we've heard a kind of a bunch of challenges, and of course they think they have changed over time too, right? I don't think Ellume, you have the same manufacturing challenges that you did in early 2021. But I'd also love to hear what were some of the big successes you think about delivering these tests, and if success is even measurable in, and what would be a great measurement of success? Anyone can jump in.
I'll have first pass at this. Difficult to measure. Obviously, the goal here is to diagnose people early in the course of the illness and prevent that downstream transmission, and thereby reduce the overall burden of disease. So, being able to measure success is a function of really getting people tested and picking up those positive cases. Ours is a connected product, so that data goes up to the cloud in a de-identified format, and we have visibility of that data. So we certainly know we diagnosed a lot of people with COVID, particularly through those peak months of at the end of 2021 and into 2022, and so I think as we were diagnosing these people, that data streaming in real time was actually, leading ahead of the data coming through the CDC, based mostly on the delays of that data and the processing that happens of that data coming from quite diverse sources. So I think in overall measuring success, it comes down to that overall approach. It's quite difficult to develop specific measures of how many people, how many cases were actually prevented. And obviously there are some very good data there about the diagnostics distributed, particularly through the centralized federally run online distribution program, where there were many millions of tests deployed out into the community, which no doubt had a huge positive impact on people's ability to diagnose illness and reduce the transmission.
Yeah, Barry, maybe you could discuss kind of in a non-emergency situation, but still distributing during a specific season for an acute illness, what kind of successes and how they might look different than specific pandemic emergency.
Yeah, I agree totally with Sean. I think it's ultimately a health impact, whether it's individual, improvement in the individual's health, or improvement in public health, or cost reduction. Those things are tough to measure. Like, we're currently seeing even ongoing debate about mask effectiveness, right? I mean, just finally people being able to look at the data and ask the bigger questions. It just takes tons of data to be able to do that. So like Sean said, maybe the constellation of information from digitally connected diagnostics, provides something, but there need to be other measures to determine effectiveness. So that's a whole body of science that is very difficult to do. I think in many cases, I think it might even be harder in the case of a home test, because you have a little bit less gathering the sort of peripheral information that might help to determine that could be even more difficult. So I would say it's not easy. It's not easily clear, but I do think it's going to be important, because funding, reimbursement are going to be driven by effectiveness. So it is something that has to be tackled.
Yeah. Matt, did you kind of, with working through the government distribution, have different measures of success? I mean, was it a numbers game in terms of how many things you can get out?
So it's so measuring an endpoint as success is difficult with an over-the-counter test, where the majority of results aren't reported back, and so you're not tracking positivity and things like that. Our program's focused a lot on accessibility and equity. So we would have, while we had the USPS distribution program in place, we would also distribute through food banks and federally qualified health centers, community health centers, and sites like that were reaching more at risk and vulnerable populations, or underinsured or uninsured populations that wouldn't have no access to these tests. Because we agree, I agree with Sean completely that it is about sort of empowering people with their own health, so that if they are informed about their diagnosis through a test, then they can make good decisions, theoretically at least, to either self-isolate or inform people and do their own contact tracing. Those outcomes are very hard to measure, but from our point of view, we look at where did the tests the federal government controlled, where did they end up, and did they fulfill a mission of access and equity and fill gaps in, say, the underinsured and uninsured market. And I think that we have good data to show that we've done that pretty thoroughly to make sure that we cover those populations.
Yeah, I think that's important to note. In the previous session, we heard about equity, and it's not just making sure that the technology can be used equity, that it's accessible, but that even in your logistics, when you're distributing, that you're distributing equitably, and that, you know, I think as Sean mentioned, it also may change over time with highs and lows in demand in different places as the outbreaks and cases spike.
Mm-hmm. And I think that raises maybe a simpler point that I sort of missed earlier, is just the ability of a person in a broad population to be able to execute the test and do it correctly. You know, the connectivity, you know, the technology bits, the manipulation, the reading of the test, if that's a part of the test. So the study design to determine that is really important, and that's what we were setting out to do initially, is just ask the question: can people run a test at home? I know that for FDA, a lot of study designs have been simulated home environment, and so I think there are questions about how realistic that is for assessing, you know, real home environment. As a point of reference, we see a lot of tests that have pretty good data at FDA based on their clinical studies, but when they're actually in a clinical setting, even not at home, released into the wild, that post-market studies often show that the performance drops quite a bit. And that's probably, I imagine, related to population diversity and user issues that might not have been identified in a more controlled study. And so I think those types of errors are likely, or issues are likely to be even more prominent for home testing. I think thinking about how to assess just from an analytical, I guess, analytical and clinical point of view, the effectiveness of the test in a real home setting, I think will be important.
Yeah, I think that's an important challenge to raise. You know, also, you know, there is an issue with scale here. The amount of data that's required to get an EUA or a 510K, you know, we're talking on the scale of hundreds and thousands, whereas the government distributed, I think, almost 1 billion home COVID tests. Now, the errors you're going to pick up in one situation are totally vastly different than the errors you're going to pick up in the other. And I think there is difficulty in finding a balance. And I think that's also where you can hear about all sorts of different issues that you may not have expected. If you're doing 100-person human factor study, you're not going to pick up the types of errors that, you know, 8 million people are going to make. So we had a question from the audience about cold chain. So, you know, we've talked about some kind of base level simple tests, but we know that technology changes, and especially with the advent of molecular or other kinds of different ingredients that may be in tests or even treatments that are shipped to people that may require cold chain. Is that kind of already in place for this home distribution for cold chain? Or is that another thing that we're going to need to potentially prepare for in the future?
Like a first pass of that. So our product is a room temperature stable product, and we weren't needing to wrestle with the cold chain challenge through the delivery of our product out into the community. It would undoubtedly, my personal perspective is, it would undoubtedly make it harder. Having to manage the supply chain in a cold format would without doubt bring cost and expense. In a year-on-year epidemic time, I do think those problems would be surmountable. You know, you can certainly buy a fair bit of milk in your local supermarkets and pharmacies, and that also has a cold chain. So I think that I think that they're accustomed to handling some of those products with a cold chain format. They're probably less accustomed to actually retailing those products and how they go through that final step to the customer. And then of course the customers taking that home and managing that in a manner which they understand. So I would tend to think in a year-on-year epidemic scenario that those challenges would be surmountable. The challenge in a pandemic, I think, would be different again, mostly based on scale and volume and storage capacities that would be required, and that would be a whole other can of worms that I didn't have direct experience with.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that it's a sort of industry standard in diagnostics to design for to avoid cold chain. And so there may be some rare technology where it might be needed, but I think that there's a lot of groundwork already, even for molecular assays, DNA and RNA based assays, to avoid cold chain. For home in particular, I think it would be tough because the cold chain requirements are going to extend into the home, and so you have to be concerned about deviation from storage requirements. And is somebody going to put a COVID test in their refrigerator next to their milk? You know, it's probably not harmful, but it is a little awkward. So it seems like the approach is to design for no cold chain requirements.
Sort of from our point of view, on the other side of that was during the shipping of the tests out of the USPS centers, some of those shipments happened during extreme weather, meaning very hot or very cold temperatures. And obviously the United States is a very diverse region as far as like a biome is concerned. So we definitely got excursion data from all the manufacturers about what were the test temperatures, how high and how low could the test be stored for how long in order for it to not be damaged. And we planned the logistics around which tests could be distributed to which regions, had more robust cold storage testing versus hot storage testing and things like that, and planned the logistics around that. But that's slightly a different question than you asked. I think the
No, I
original
think that's
pregnancy
helpful.
tests, back in the 80s were cold storage or cold chain distribution. And so it's obviously possible, but people like Sean definitely don't want to pay for that, right? It's way cheaper and simpler to have it on the shelf rather than in the fridge.
Yeah,
And
I
for
think this
those,
brings, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to quickly mention for those who aren't familiar with FDA requirements that type of shipping stability testing is a required part of the submission, even for emergency use authorization, where you test at different shipping temperatures.
Yes, I did draft that study that was required while at my time at FDA, and we pulled kind of the outline for that study from just kind of general shipping recommendations for biological samples in general. But I do think this is bringing up a good point that sometimes your logistical challenges have to be solved before you even get to logistics, right? So, you know, what I think everybody said here is the cold chain is not the problem. You have to develop a product that doesn't need the cold chain. And, you know, we're hearing, so it really seems that when you're thinking about a product that is going to go into people's homes, you have to think about all of the challenges during development rather than develop a product and then move it into people's homes. I think this is kind of different from something that you're maybe targeting to a professional audience. You're going to be very focused on kind of getting that performance where you need it to be, but there's much more concern about logistics and human factors when you're thinking about products that are meant to be used for lay users. Oh, wow, we have some more questions coming in from the audience. So this is interesting. So what factors do companies who are developing products take into account when seeking distribution partners? So, you know, what are you evaluating when you're looking, you know, you've decided that USPS is the way to go, or you've decided that you're going to use Amazon warehouse. I guess the question is really, how are you evaluating your shipping process?
So I can take a first pass at that. When we evaluated the process, we were looking for large, nationwide, reliable, highly experienced distribution partners that would be able to carry what is actually quite a significant weight of taking it from a series of distribution centers spread across the country, as CBS, to take an example, have, and get it from there out into the communities across all across the US. That and that is in pursuit of equity. Getting it into those communities, be they metropolitan or rural, is very important. And so seeking partners that are able to do that was a key focus for us. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of commercial considerations to that that I think kind of go without saying. And obviously, seasonal epidemic times would be different to pandemic times, when I think, all of those big companies were doing their darndest to be helpful and to bend over backwards and to bend or sometimes break rules that they would normally have on a commercial basis. And so the goal would be to find ways to get it out to as many people as quickly as possible. That was our experience.
And I have, maybe it's actually a question for Sean and Matthew, but before the pandemic, we were kind of asking those kinds of questions, like, for a study or pandemic response, how, from a sort of an academic point of view, how can we get things out quickly? And yet, you have to think about partnering with organizations that can do distribution locally or rapid delivery. But I think a lot of those issues have probably been overcome at this point. I'm curious if there are things that need to be done in advance of the next emergency to lay the groundwork for that, or is it a solved issue and the path is already paved to plug into those distribution options?
So I felt that there's been a lot of growth. The world has changed quite a lot too, right? There was this incredible growth in home delivery services, from food to all sorts of things that has changed, and pickup of groceries and curbside pickup of pharmaceuticals, that whilst I think that a lot of them did exist pre-pandemic, they've certainly blossomed through the pandemic out of need. I tend to think that a lot of that technology has evolved to the point now where there are definitely other ways to deliver those products. And I think that gets a whole lot more interesting again when you go the next step, as clinical studies really need to do, which is to figure out how to treat those people who are worthy of treating, in terms of, are they treatable in terms of early in the course of the illness? Do they meet the criteria for inclusion of treatment? That becomes the next step. For flu, for example, where you've got a 48-hour treatment window and people don't tend to do the test on hour 1, they tend to do it well in, you do have a least limited time window. And so I think it does end up being a two-step process in terms of solving logistics. And I think we are, the building blocks that are going to enable a solution there, particularly the home delivery of the medicines, is going to naturally evolve over time as these products become more commonplace.
And how quickly can that be turned on, with Amazon or like the USPS to get delivery, or is that something that, if it was prearranged, would be faster?
I don't have direct experience with USPS. Certainly Matt and the incredible team at ASPR, would be able to give a better perspective on that. I think Amazon has a lot of the initial delivery pieces there, and their ability to turn on and off quite quickly is already in existence. The second piece of that puzzle of getting people treated, that doesn't really exist yet. I don't think we've connected those dots to be able to go from a positive result to a clinical decision, to a prescription being ordered, to drugs being dispensed, and then drugs being delivered. That loop hasn't been fully solved yet. There's a couple of groups that are getting closer, but it's certainly not at scale yet.
Yeah, Matt, maybe we can hear from you about the USPS choice and that, and then we can talk about kind of tests to treat, as it were, when it comes to home diagnostics.
Yeah, our focus for a while was sort of establishing these relationships with the internal government and NGO partners that could assist with the test distribution, getting tests where they want. The choice to use the USPS was an obvious one if you wanted to reach everybody, because they're really the only organization in the US government that has everybody's address, right? And could handle the volume that the COVID-test.gov mission was going to put on. So, and really building that relationship and understanding all of the moving pieces and challenges along with it, I think in the future it is definitely an option. And in building it, like putting it back into place after it gets mothballed or put in storage, putting it back into service should be easier than building it the first time, because we understand what we had to do and what the requirements were on the USPS side and what the requirements on sort of the test purchase and storage and distribution side were. All of that has been worked out at this point. So I think we're in a pretty good place if we had to respond to another pandemic in the future and use a distribution for either drugs or, like Sean said, pharma or other materials that can be sent through the mail. I think it's something that would be of value in the future.
I mean, I think it's encouraging to hear. It seems like everybody's kind of pretty positive about the ability to do this in the future when needed. We've kind of forged the difficult path already, and it's greased the tracks for any future kind of distribution. I think coming full circle, what we heard from the physicians earlier this morning was a specific example about COVID tests being performed by people at home, not getting into the VA system in a reliable way that's not integrating into the EHR. I can say from experience at the FDA, while that, it was an intent at the beginning for home COVID tests, the challenge in an emergency of needing the tests quite rapidly was kind of outweighed the benefits of tracking all of that data and setting up the systems quickly. I know that NIH under the POC is setting up systems for reporting, but I think the idea of having something integrate into the EHR or being sent to your physician for actionable data and linking the test to treat is something that's really interesting with logistics. So it's not just the test, it's getting that healthcare to people. We've seen kind of a giant increase in telehealth, but I think we're still really in the pilot stage of test to treat, and everybody's kind of doing it their own way. I'd be interested to hear kind of how you think the logistics of doing test to treat. Is it going to be a rolled in package where you buy the test and you're also kind of getting, not for free or included in the test price, your health visit? Or do you think it will move to a prescription model where the prescriber is then, reinforcing their prescription with follow-on care? Or do you think it's going to be more of a piecemeal, you kind of figure it out, and maybe what's the best strategy to go with?
I think maybe others may know more about this than I do, actually, but if you look at the Q website, one of the diagnostics companies, they, I believe, have in operation a cycle for test to treat. And what's interesting, if you look at the website, is that they offer that for their test, but also for other tests provided by other makers, which I think implies that it implies a business model that is not centric necessarily to their diagnostic as the main thing. As Sean said, it seems like those pieces are coming together, but they may actually be in operation, at least in one instance today.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. So the Q would certainly, he'd be doing a great job at the tip of the spear there of connecting those dots and bringing that together. A few parts to that question, I suppose. Point one is on that data capture and being able to get that into electronic health records. And in a country where there's so many different systems and those systems don't even necessarily talk to one another or between them in in a robust or consistent manner, actually getting that data from a home test where we do it, getting it to just getting it to the individual states is quite a big challenge in and of itself. Getting it directly into people's or people's clinician of choice's inbox is quite a significant undertaking, and is certainly non-trivial. The second point is that there is quite broad-seeded skepticism of data capture in the community, and we certainly weren't expecting. We treat this data very sensitively, and we try to capture as little data as we possibly can. We do that for the purposes of informing public health and for no other. And despite that, and we're quite clear about this in the privacy policy and so on and so forth, despite that, there are enough people that have been burned from privacy breaches in the past, and that doesn't just limit it at a fringe group that are skeptical of everything. This is a very significant part of the reasonable American base that don't really want to share data. So I think there is some challenges there to overcome. And then, thirdly, being able to connect the dots and tie that all together. The American reimbursement system is relatively disparate, and so trying to have ways that come together is in a national unified way is going to be very difficult. I think it will emerge in pockets first, and gradually over time, I would expect those to become more widely accepted and spread through and into other healthcare systems.
Yeah, so we did get to pivot a little bit. I think that's a great discussion on kind of how we link to care and the challenges there. So this is a little bit of a pivot to expiration dates. So expiration dates have become quite the complicated situation. You're required to have an expiration date when you go to FDA. But you can still continue to be doing your stability studies, and that expiration date may change. And then, you have to monitor your expiration dates in storage. And so how are you developing systems for expiration dates so that the customer is updated about the most recent and the appropriate expiration date on a product? And how is that affecting how you're managing product in the shipment process and the storage process?
Maybe Sean first.
Yeah,
Matthew.
I think Matt's probably got an interesting perspective on this. No doubt there's been a lot of challenges.
Right. So when we established the diagnostic stockpile, it became very obvious that the biggest challenge, one of the largest challenges, was going to be managing for shelf life and just understanding what the shelf life is. I come from the FDA as well. Gina and I are both CDRH people. And so I understand the labeling requirements for it, but there were times when I just wished, like, why isn't there just a 2D barcode on every box? You can take a photo with your phone and then take you to a website at the manufacturer that tells you what the expiration date for that lot is. It just felt, it felt so circuitous for us and for the customers at the end to determine what their actual expiration date is. And we still get incoming from clinics and things saying you shipped us expired tests. We say, no, please check this website. It's a big challenge, and we appreciate the continued extensions of those shelf lives. We absolutely do, because if the data support the use of that test for another 6 months, then we absolutely would prefer that be the case, so we have more time to distribute those tests and have them still be safe and effective to use for the populations. But it has been quite a confusing and labor-intensive time to communicate what the actual expiration dates of materials are and to manage our own inventory on a continuously moving target, as far as what the actual expiration of each device is. But like I said, we appreciate all the work that's gone into making these things, and I 100% understand the regulatory position of the FDA about labeling of these devices. So it's the best solution we have right now.
It's it seems like if you were to envision the ideal situation, it would be a test that cannot operate if it's past its expiration, based on, as you said, a barcode or a lockout that would prevent it. And some, I mean, assume that like the Ellume system would be capable of doing that, since it's electronic readout. So that's something that could be potentially updated live, as new data comes in, that information is updated and it's unlocked, for a longer period of time. But I know all tests don't have that capability.
Yeah, so we did do that, Barry. So we program into the device the expiration date into the product. When we designed that feature in the beginning, we just determined that we'd put that in firmware. We'd actually put that on the disposable cartridge, and that makes it harder than you might at first think to change that expiration date going forwards. So it actually meant that it was stored not just on a label on the box, but it was also stored on the device. It becomes non-trivial in terms of also the component in the kit which expires first. Most of these kits have multiple different bits to it, and it's not necessarily the analyzer that's the first part to expire. So you do end up with quite a complicated tracking process to be able to do it. Achievable, definitely, but complicated. I think this has caused huge headaches for everybody, certainly for the companies, certainly for ASPR, certainly for the FDA. A huge amount of energy has gone into reviewing these things. I do wonder if it's not a place where, when the dust settles, it's something that perhaps as part of the emergency use authorization framework, it could be explored whether or not a unified single approach to managing expiry dates and guidance around that for manufacturers might save a lot of energy and heartache for everybody next time around. I think everyone's just sort of tried to manage it. As Matt said, everyone's tried to do the best they can, and we fully understand and appreciate why these rules exist. However, it's something that will happen again next time, and perhaps there is a way with a 2D barcode or other sorts, or enable that in firmware or software to be able to manage that a bit more proactively.
Yeah, we did have one question about readers and kind of the idea of a standard format of readers or cassettes that could be mixed or matched. That, I think, during the pandemic, we've seen that it's been a lot of individualized products, and that, there's specific solutions, whether it's an app or a reader or a test, that have come specifically with the test. And it is, I think, also quite challenging regulatory wise to have something that's universal for all tests, but perhaps could solve logistical challenges. It could also be, I think, the idea that maybe that's more involved in the linkage to care, to have something slightly more standardized, like United Healthcare will have an app where it will collect data about your test result so that to link you to treatment and care. I happen to think that it's probably not going to come. I think that is in terms of development a long way off, in terms of having kind of a very universal reader, just because a reader can impact the test performance. The Ellume device has been engineered specifically to have a reader to get good performance. And, other devices that don't have a reader are known to have kind of lower performance in general. We've kind of traditionally seen in diagnostics development, you add a reader, you increase performance. And I think also there's also challenges with visual read. So I do think readers are good, especially when we talk about equity and diversity, right? You can't have a color changing test and give that to the thousands of people who have color blindness in the country. So I think there is a place for readers, but I don't think that anytime soon we'll have universal readers. I don't know if anybody else has a thought or opinion on that.
I'll go first here. So I don't think there'll be any one diagnostic technology that is the pervasive one in the future for future epidemics or pandemics. I think that there will be different technologies which serve different purposes, and in some cases have important advantages for different parts of the population, particularly visually impaired people is one of those, but there are certainly other very important groups that do have significantly different needs in terms of using products. And we certainly have spent a lot of time thinking about that and trying to enable our product to be used by as many of those people as we can. I might also say that different technologies that have different use at different stages of a pandemic. In the very beginning, knowing where the new organism is very useful. Being able to track that down I think is helpful, very helpful. Once you get beyond that stage and the illness is prevalent and ubiquitous in the community, that ability to track, case by case becomes less important and less valuable there. So I think we'll find that the strengths and weaknesses of technologies from features and data capture and blind usability and so on and so forth, those trade-offs versus cost and manufacturing scale, those are things that mean that it won't just be one technology, I think, and there needs to be multiple pieces of that for that to work out, and that certainly needs to include the molecular products, which have a very important place to play in particular population groups, especially. In terms of having one reader that can do multiple, I think that we'll find that there are cartridges around that are designed to do that. I know Ellume is, amongst others, putting a lot of work into figuring that out.
I think that's a great place to end our discussion, that, there's going to be a need for lots of different solutions. But as we've learned, there's a lot to think about when we think about getting things into people's homes and logistics. I want to thank our panelists. This is a really rich discussion, and I think we learned a lot. And I'm going to turn it over to my boss, Dr. Sharetta, who's going to be talking to us about payers and investors contributing to technology development. Thank you, everybody.